By my count, this was the 31st night I'd heard the tapping. You would think I'd be accustomed to it, or that I would find a way to sleep through it. My biological clock now had a new alarm built in for this time of night. I suspect that even if or when the tapping on the window ended, my body would force me to wake at this exact moment indefinitely. The tapping scares me more with each new occurrence. When you consider that I am greeted by the same person, and that the same exchange occurs verbatim as those 30 times prior, it would make sense that the meeting would have the diminishing effect of nothing more than boredom at this point. After all, I'm not in any mortal danger, unless I act on the request being brought before me, which I am not obligated to accept. However, I know with certainty that tonight's meeting at the window will fill me with more pain and sadness than the night before, simply due to the fact that it brings the mistakes of my childhood closer to the forefront of my mind. I remember vividly the first night that it happened. I was in a deep REM sleep. I don't recall that I had been dreaming prior to the noise of the window, but it took a lot of tapping to drag me from my deep state of unconsciousness. It took me a minute to shake off the blurriness and remember where I was. The tapping had traveled from the dream state to reality. At first, I considered that it was being caused by the branches of a tree just outside my bedroom window. However, the steady rhythm and distinct tone meant that the sound had to have originated from a person. It was unmistakable. I sat up in bed and looked over at the window. The figure of a very small person was manifest in shadow. Its outline followed the waves of the curtain, with the light of the moon making its features more prominent. The slight figure was complete, with one hand raised up in the air. Perhaps this was a different neighborhood kid that was looking for a different house and found mine by mistake. I didn't have a lot of patience for children in the middle of the night, but I also wasn't a complete dick. I wouldn't deny anyone help if they needed it that bad. I was just a little worried about the optics of a single adult male escorting a boy back home at 2 a.m. I went to the window and slid back the curtain. It took a few seconds before my brain could register what I was seeing. Once I recognized the boy, I went into shock. Sean Wheatley was not a boy anymore. I mean, technically he was still a boy, because he never got the chance to grow up. He was my same age when he died. He was buried at the Sunset Meadows Cemetery about 10 miles from here. I know because I attended the services. He was my best friend, and we played together almost every day. Sean looked up at me from outside the window. As he was preparing to tell me something, I observed that not only had he not aged, but he was living, breathing, and tangible. "Hey Will, want to go down and swing over the creek?" That was all he said. He looked up at me expectantly, but wasn't impatient about it. I must have made him wait forever for a response, as I had about 1,000,000 thoughts race through my mind. I didn't say yes or no, I just asked, "Sean, is that you?" "Yeah, who else would it be?" "I don't think so, Sean. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, Sean." A split second later, Sean was gone. I'd forgotten all about Sean, mostly because I forced myself to forget him. Sean's death was the kind of thing that I trained myself to wrap in multiple layers of covering and push down into the inky black crevasse of the farthest region of my mind. In fact, I'd hardly recognized him when I first saw him at the window. Some adults, like the therapist and my parents, would try and convince me over and over again that I had no reason to blame myself over Sean's death. But that's like trying to tell someone with a chemical imbalance in their brain, just don't be depressed. As you can imagine, the first day was a real struggle. Not only had I not slept the night before, but I spent all day trying to wrap my brain around the vision of Sean Wheatley at the window. I tried to comfort myself by reasoning that it was a one-time occurrence, but oh, how I was wrong. I couldn't believe it. I looked at the clock. The illumination of the numbers shone brightly, searing into my retinas. 1:57 a.m. Maybe it wasn't Sean this time. I looked over at the window and saw the same short and slender silhouette. I couldn't do it. I ignored the tapping for a couple of hours, but Sean was relentless. The tapping even maintained the same tempo and fervor, suggesting that Sean's resolve was not going to wane. I got up and answered Sean at the window. "Hey Will, want to go down and swing over the creek?" I needed to be more bold and abrupt. "No, Sean. Please don't come tapping on my window anymore either." Everything about the events of the night before were the same except one. I could have sworn that Sean was dry last night. This time his hair was wet and disheveled. Other than that, his words and mannerisms were repeated verbatim. Over the next few nights, I tried to shake things up around the house to escape the tapping on the window. Though I lived in a small place, I attempted an escape to every other room in the house. I even wore some earplugs or noise-canceling headphones, but the tapping penetrated the insulating barrier of those items somehow. It was as if Sean had found a way to tap directly on my eardrum. Since it became obvious that I wasn't getting away from Sean, I started answering him at the window each night as promptly as possible. After all, he never actually insisted that I followed him down to the creek. Something else was happening, something horrifying. With each new appearance, Sean's body decayed before my eyes. His face turned puffy and waterlogged. His cheeks were swollen gray and smooth. The tiny black threads of veins in his face showed through from under his skin. His eyes became cloudy, such that I could no longer determine if he was truly looking up at me. His hair, still wet, became patchy and thin. Perhaps if I allowed this to go on long enough, Sean's body might disintegrate into nothing but a pile of wet bones. The idea of talking to such a thing each and every night made me physically ill. Then again, the decay of Sean's body also presented a potential termination point to which I could anticipate. If I waited long enough, this nightly event would end on its own. I worked through every possible solution or distraction I could think of to rid myself of this curse. I could ask a friend or family member to stay the night, see if the presence of another person could break the chain. Then I thought how awkward that might get if either they heard the tapping and had to share my nightmare, or if they had to witness me getting up all of a sudden and talking to absolutely no one at the window. There's a popular trope in film and television with stories where the protagonist is stuck in some kind of time loop. They usually find that they need to perform a selfless act to escape the loop. I know by now you must have realized that I'm purposely avoiding the one thing that is needed to break the loop. I need to agree to go with Sean. I will tell this story only one last time, then never again. I will tell it so you may know why I cannot agree to go with Sean. It was a late summer afternoon. Whenever we discovered something new that was fun, Sean became obsessed. We often had to play the same games over and over again until we became sick of them. There was a spot on the creek where the leaves of a willow tree hung down like vines. We discovered that you could bunch them together and swing across like Tarzan. If you grabbed only one or two, they wouldn't hold your weight. We swung back and forth for hours, ensuring that our hands were filled with enough vines to keep us suspended in the air. No doubt Sean continued to think about the fun we had at the creek all evening. He wasn't supposed to leave again after dark, but on the rare occasion he would come tapping on the window late at night. On this particular evening, Sean could not be parted with the idea of visiting that spot on the creek. When Sean came and tapped on my window, I agreed to go down to the creek for a few more swings. When we arrived, Sean was anxious to go first. Once one of us felt that we had gathered a sufficient number of vines, the other would inspect the bundle. We didn't need to be manly or take unnecessary risks. Neither of us wanted to get caught by coming home soaking wet. Sean showed me the vines in his hand. It was so dark, I honestly couldn't see well enough to be certain. "You're good," I said. Sean trusted me, and why shouldn't he? As young boys, we were invincible. Really, we were only invincible because we hadn't yet experienced any major accident, which would teach us that hard lesson about the frailty of the young human body. The runoff was especially heavy this season, so the creek was higher and swifter than usual. Sean barely made it a foot or two into his swing before the flimsy bundle of vines snapped. He disappeared into the creek. It didn't take long for him to surface, but in that brief moment the current had already dragged him 5 or 10 yards downstream. "Help!" Sean's yelling was half vocalized. The other half of his cries were muffled in a gurgling spout as he became swept under the strong current. I ran along the bank as fast as my feet would carry me. I knew that if I jumped in to try and save him, there was a good chance I would get dragged under as well. If I'd been thinking clearly, I would have gone to get help immediately, but instead I fell to the ground, buried my face in the dirt, and hoped this was just a bad dream that would just end soon. I endured Sean's visits for several more months, from when they had begun. With each new appearance, Sean's body was reduced to fragments, to the extent that he was no longer recognizable. Sure enough, the day arrived when I was certain that Sean had disintegrated into nothingness. It was over. For the first time in a while, I was left in peace. I didn't sleep all night, of course, because my body would no longer allow me a full night's sleep, but I waited for the tapping on the window, and it never came. The next evening, I prepared for the long and arduous process of retraining myself to forget, to leave Sean behind once again. I took a sleeping pill and lay down to rest. I opened my eyes. Tears welled up. I closed them once again as the discharge poured down both cheeks simultaneously. I approached the window, pulled open the curtains, and looked down to find a dry and whole young boy looking up at me expectantly. "Hey, Will, want to go down and swing over the creek?" "Yeah, let's go, Sean. Hang on just a minute while I grab some shoes."